right, so we're recording now. All right, and I'm here. I'm not in Hat Studio today because my old friend David Kippen is not in Houston. You are. How is the what do you call it? The Golden State? It's the Golden State, right?
Golden State. That's what
So
we
you're
call it.
yeah. So you've been so David Kippen, who I've known for some years now, and you've been on the other show with me. I think right. We did a
Right.
podcast episode on the oil and gas thing, but this is a brand new show. It's a brand new. Hopefully, it's going to be a new network, and I just thought that whatever you and I would talk about in terms of an oil and gas technology conversation it doesn't hold a candle to what we talk about when we're just hanging out and talking. so the point of this one is to bring some of the goodness of our non industry conversation into the show. So thanks for making time.
Well, thank you, Michael. And you'll notice I've got an oil and gas themed painting behind me, just for the old
I
times.
did you what I mean what did you have to go through to get that to put
I
that?
actually had to go upstairs. My grandmother's an artist, and this is just a painting that she once did down in the Gulf of a rig. Now, she was very much an environmentalist. She was not in
Yeah.
tune with oil and gas at all, but apparently one day, it's just a beautiful day. It was a beautiful afternoon, and I think it's kind of a stunning
Yeah,
painting.
it
So
is. So
it's
where
actually,
was? I mean, was she out on a boat? Because
I
she
have
was
no
pretty
idea.
close to the rig when she was painting that. I think.
I was probably not born yet. I have no idea. I just heard the story of like why this, and it was a beautiful day.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and the coastline was probably further out back then, so she
Could
was a
well
lot
be.
closer to the. Wait, so where was she? Where on the? I didn't even realize that you had family in this area.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have family all over the place. So I was born in Vienna, Austria,
Right.
to a South African father and a mother who was born and raised in Hawaii and Japan.
Mm.
My grandmother was Hawaiian. Her family were missionaries who settled there in like the 1820s. My grandfather taught himself Japanese, so they went and he taught English in Japan before the war, then translated during the war, World War II, and came back to here. The reason my family ended up in Berkeley was because he did his dissertation on control of Japanese foreign policy at UC Berkeley after
Huh.
World War II.
Wow. So I don't. There was so much in everything you just. I didn't even realize it was. I knew about the. Well, I knew about Germany. I don't think I knew that. What did you say? Your father was South African?
Yeah,
Yeah. So I regret to inform you that even though this is only the like fifth or sixth episode of this show, you're not the first South African. To be honest,
really. Oh,
there's
that's
already been one
extraordinary.
before you. What are
Well,
the
I don't know
chances?
that I call
You're
myself a
everywhere.
South African. I'm probably closer to an Austrian, though.
Yeah. Yeah.
Who knows? Who cares?
Yeah. Who knows? Okay. So a lot going on there, and of course. I heard about this little branding agency that you started. How long has it been? When did you start Aviva Brands?
Oh gosh, 2008. So it's been what 13, 14 years. It's been a
Yeah,
while.
yeah, yeah.
And we started with the thought, let's fail fast, let's do this thing, and if it's not going to work, we'll learn quickly. And so far, knock wood, we've been
Yeah.
doing pretty well for a while now.
I know you must be busy because you almost never answer my emails and phone calls whenever I try
Not true.
to. Not true. Not true. But I know it's been good. So there's two interesting things about you that to me always uh, is well, there's lots of interesting things about it, but there's two things that make your perspective on things always kind of interesting and fun. One is the being in the branding and marketing business, right? Because you have and especially the degree to which you've worked with people all over the world and things like that. So you see things through a certain lens that not everybody else does. The other is that my favorite thing about you, and I am glad that you don't make me call you Dr. Kippen, but you have a PhD in rhetoric, which a lot of people don't even outside of a rhetorical question, which I think most people even don't really know what that means. I would it'd be hard for me to probably find somebody on the street to give a good definition of what rhetoric is, much less having a PhD in it. So explain that a little bit.
It's a great question. So my doctoral focus was on rhetoric. My PhD is actually in the Department of English, not Department of Philosophy, but rhetoric is a branch of
Right.
philosophy that started with Aristotle. And
Mm.
Aristotle, famously, at one point, he'd written a bunch of books on poetics and logic and so on and so forth. And he writes in this book that comes to be known as the Rhetoric. Now, we've established all of the ways that a good argument is constructed and why a good argument should be persuasive, so on and so forth. But we have to look at the fact that often the best argument doesn't win. Why is that? Well,
Yeah.
let's look at rhetoric, which is, for him, the art of persuasion. Now, if you talk to somebody about having a background in rhetoric in Europe, they think that's like having a doctorate in used car sales. It's just a really dirty term. But actually, the focus is on a really simple, interesting question, which is, why do people make decisions contrary to their own interest? And you can see how working on answering that question is a just great proving ground for a career in advertising, which is all about helping people to
Oh,
make
yeah.
decisions in alignment with whatever your corporate sponsor wants. But I'll say that in my view, rhetoric needs to be a white hat profession in that, you know, it if I worked in politics, I'd be
Yeah.
working on making people decide the way I wanted them to decide. Actually, the way it works in branding is try to figure out, among the things that you can say honestly about the company you're representing, what's the thing with the most impact, interest, long-term significance to the people you're trying to reach, and how do you help them see that thing clearly? That's basically how it applies and what it is.
Yeah. Yeah, because it, if you're trying to persuade somebody to do something that's completely out of their character or out of whatever, then that becomes a con, right?
Yeah.
Sort of, right? I mean, that's kind of what a confidence artist would do. So, but if you're talking about rhetoric or you're talking about branding, you have to start with some essence of something real. Like, it has to resonate with the person on some level. They have to be drawn toward. There has to be something there, right? You can't just. Otherwise, you're just pulling the wool over people's eyes, which
Well, I think there,
which you
I
could be in.
mean, I
You
think
could
there
be
are
in
two
politics
things.
then, but not in branding.
Yeah, I think so. I think there are two things to untangle there. One of them, when you talk about making decisions contrary to interest, that's more like, why do I have a cookie when I'm already full and I'm about to go to bed? And I know that's not something I should do,
Yeah,
right? So on the
yeah,
one hand, I've got a rational interest in not doing this thing, but on the other hand, I just do it. We do that all the time. And actually, if you look at the science on this, it's amazing how many decisions we make spontaneously, emotionally, call it what you will, and then after the fact, post facto, rationalize why we did what we did. We think of ourselves as these rational actors who are actually carefully deliberating before we do anything. Fact is, it's almost always the opposite. We're very impulsive, and we don't know why we do what we do a lot of the time. So part of what on the advertising side we study is,
yeah,
okay, so what are people doing? And then asking them, well, why did you do that? And trying to figure out what the disconnect is and
yeah,
trying to figure out how to connect the what and the why in a more direct way. Right.
yeah.
So,
I like that. I'm sorry. And I wasn't. The reason I was laughing is because at some point, something in there you said, my wife and I call it the third martini syndrome. Like, why do you have that third martini? You know that you're not
yeah.
gonna. It's not. It's not gonna be. And you know the old saying, right? Is I don't know. Maybe you don't know this one about martinis.
I don't know many martini sayings.
Is okay, how does it go? Okay, one is just right, two is too many, and three is not enough.
That's excellent. And actually, that raises a really good point. I think alcohol is a wonderful clarifier. That old in vino veritas thing. We've
Yes,
all
yes,
got a little gremlin inside us that after a few drinks, you figure out what that little gremlin really is all about and wants to do.
yeah, yeah,
And that's another way of saying there's this rational actor. superego or whatever and this id that
Yes.
are at war, and we're kind of caught in the middle during our daily lives.
Right, right. By the way, Kid Rock's version of that is a drunk man's words are a sober man's thoughts.
Well said.
That was what he said. And but yeah, it's interesting. Okay, so I don't want to get too far off, although that is we could do a whole episode on that. But we're still in the first few episodes of this new show, so I don't want to wander from the theme too much until we've worn it out sufficiently. So. And you and I were chatting before we turned on the microphones, Saving the Dream, the book. The reason why I didn't incorporate that, I've already said it on a couple of episodes, so I don't want people to, every time they turn the thing on, to think that I'm going to explain the book again. But you had, so the book, Epic of America, where we kind of get this concept of the American dream, or it's not where we get the concept. The concept was already built into what was happening. He just sort of put those words together. But you had an interesting observation about that. You said because of what was it? You said because it was written in 1931, right? So right in the middle of the Depression, or early. I guess that's early Depression.
Yeah, pretty early. I mean, so 1929 is when the stock
Yeah,
market
yeah.
tanks. And I think 31, 32, 33 are when it really starts to be felt by everybody in pretty dramatic ways. And I was just struck as you told me about the theme by the tremendous optimism of somebody saying, in 1931, we've arrived. You know, you can get by here. You can have a life that's, you said, better, richer, and fuller
Yeah.
in the midst of the Great Depression, and by the way, in the middle of the two epic wars that defined that century. That's quite something. That's quite a statement of optimism in and of itself.
Yeah. Now, there would be some people who would say, well, sure, it was easy for him to make that statement of optimism because he came from a family that had money and things were nice for him, and he wasn't really in touch with what was going on with the real people, which, of course, you and I didn't know him, so we have no way of commenting on that too much. But what do you think? But as a rule, a lot of things people that's an argument that is used to discredit things a lot. Somebody makes a statement, somebody has a viewpoint, and somebody says, "Well, you don't know because your life's been good." Do you think does that discredit people from having a valid point of view?
Obviously not. I think the challenge is it's really easy to make broad blanket statements that don't cover a lot of life experiences very well. Obviously, in the 1930s, if you were black, if you were not, if you were Polish, if you were a variety of things that today would
Yeah.
either still be problematic or not, you'd have a different view of
Yeah,
that.
we
Also,
Italians didn't have it so
if you
good
were
either at that time. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Also, if you were very hard scrabble, poor, poorly educated, and in an environment without a lot of jobs for manual labor, I'm sorry, you didn't have a lot of opportunities. And some dynamic like that is always going to play out. And yet, if you look at the American experiment, I think it's broadly true that for most of us, more of us have more opportunity in this country than in many other places. And that was even more true earlier in the last century than it
Yeah.
probably is today. Now, that might be a bit surprising. A lot of people would push back and say, no, actually, not so. And certainly, again, particularly if you're black, that's less likely to be true. But if you compare our freedoms today and our opportunities today in this country to a number of countries in Europe, I think we don't compare as favorably in terms of things like class mobility as we would have roughly a century ago.
So okay, so you think that, and I want to come back to because you mentioned, I know you mentioned earlier you've done a lot of market research in developing countries, so I want to get that point of view, but you're saying right now we don't compare as favorably to Europe as we would have before.
To some countries in Europe, right? So the stereotype of Europe has for a very long time been that there's no class mobility and class is everything, right? That social mobility, even if you accrue wealth, you're kept down by a class system that doesn't recognize wealth and attainment as equivalent to class. Well, that class system has eroded a lot in the last century.
Hmm.
And because Europe in general, and broadly speaking, I'm talking maybe more of the Nordic parts of Europe than in Southern Europe,
Sure.
but generally, European countries have higher taxation rates and higher baseline standards of living for most people than Americans have. The bottom line is that the bottom part of our economy can fall a lot farther and fall a lot harder
Oh,
than
yeah.
in an environment with a much higher tax base and stronger safety net. Ergo, you have potential challenges in mobility here that don't present in in a marketplace with a better base to it.
Yeah. So, and we hear that argument presented like in the U.S. about when people are arguing about what we should be, particularly the government, particularly the federal government, what the federal government should be doing or shouldn't be doing, and things like this. And people a lot of times will say, "Well, this is how they do it in Norway. This is how they do it in Sweden." They used to sometimes say Canada, but not so much anymore. But yeah, but and yet, we also just and I think you and I have been around long enough to look, just have a little bit of a perspective that says in this country we haven't seen a clear correlation where the government taking more money from the people in the form of taxes has a great yield in the way it like makes, like, most of the time I want to say stop helping, right? Because they don't seem to and maybe it's just my perspective, but why is it that in those countries they can say, okay, well, give us most of your money and life is going to be pretty good for everybody, and over here they can keep taking more and more money and it just seems to be like more and more of a mess.
Yeah, well, I
Is it
think
the size and the complexity or the
so.
you know
In the first place, let me be clear that I wasn't making a comparison of Europe good, America bad. I was just talking
no,
about
that's clear, but
mobility, right? But to your point, I think there are two other factors, or maybe three, we have to bring in to that comparison. One of them, I don't care where you come from in this country or what you do, democracy is just messy. It's really hard when we have as many cross currents at the local, at the state, at the federal level, at the state versus state level at play for money of any kind to find its best purpose. The
yeah,
second thing I'd say is nowhere in Europe is there as large an investment made in the military as we make. So a lot of that tax money,
yeah, fair enough.
we see the benefit of it in being the world's most powerful military. You and I both served. That's an important thing, and I don't mean to underplay it, but at the same time, a lot of those tax dollars just disappear in places that we
Right.
can't see except in our safety. So, I mean, and then you get the state by state comparisons. You're in Texas right now. I'm in California right
Yeah.
now. We have at the state level very different ideas about how what the state should fund, what the federal government should fund, how that should work. And because every state's sort of its own laboratory and they're not very good at learning from each other, we don't have that homogeneity that a small country, relatively speaking, like Finland or Estonia or Sweden
Yeah.
will have that says, hey, we've got a best practice here. It's actually solving specific problems. Let's invest more in that and make it work. But I mean, I think the whole comparison, the closer you look, gets more problematic. I think the larger point to look at is for most of us, is there more opportunity in a structure like this than a structure like that? And I think the answer is probably yes, though compared to some time ago, maybe not so much as what was once the case. In California, for example,
Hmm.
in my part of California, if you're young, you're pretty much priced out of a good life in the Bay Area. You have to make some, really difficult decisions about how to live and where to live here unless you've already landed a well-paying job, which is reliant on having had a well-paid education and having a skill
Hmm.
set that works here and so on and so forth. That's true in a lot of major metro areas in the United States. And
Yeah.
I'd argue it's truer than it used to be. When you and I were kids, you could have a good craft training, be good at a craft, at a trade,
Right.
and make a reasonable living in your community, have a nice
Where
house.
anywhere.
And
Yeah.
that would be true if you were a doctor or a lawyer or a postman. I don't think
Yeah.
it's true for the postman today anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, they keep losing stuff, so that's not working in their favor. But but um, so this is a really interesting point, which is almost to say, in terms of this notion of the American dream, that we had it, and then we kind of lost it a little bit in some places, not entirely, but and again, I think one of the, so just as a little sidebar and to kind of throw back at the thing you were saying before, to me, so I'm a big advocate for the remember in the founding days of the country. I mean, I know you don't remember firsthand,
Not personally.
but maybe you heard from your dad. And no, in those early days, there was a lot of disagreement about the states versus the national versus and states' rights, and that continued on into the Civil War and everything else, right? So, but and there's political theories and arguments on both sides, but I've always thought the concept of the original concept of a republic, this federation of these states that were largely autonomous and held together at the national level by a government that would provide, the fundamental things like protect the borders and regulate interstate trade and things like this. Like, just in terms of if I'm building a system, that approach seems to be better because of the scale issue. Like you can one of the reasons why in Norway they're able to maybe do some of the things, I think do some of the things that they do, is because they only have 5 million people, right? That's in the whole country. It's 5 million people. So if you're solving a problem for 5 million people, if you're solving a problem for 5 million people and I'm solving a problem for 5 million people somewhere else, we can make decisions and we can fine tune that solution to that group of people in that scenario. But if I'm in the aggregate trying to solve the problem for 400 million people in different places with different problems, like you just articulated between California and Texas, now like the math just becomes impossible. Like how do you even the equation there, like you're just asking for trouble. So, however, nonetheless, over the last 150 years, 100 years mainly, since he wrote the book, our national government has grown and grown and grown and grown and grown, probably to a place where nobody ever had envisioned it having. I mean, how many million people work, right, for the federal government, and so I wonder if that doesn't cause some of those difficulties, but. So feel free to comment on that if you disagree. But I also like this thing that you said, which is we're like we had it, and now it's kind of slipping away. Like why is that?
I wouldn't say it's slipping. Well, let me comment on your first point. So you're kind of saying it's hard to compare a fishing boat to the USS Enterprise, and that's true.
Yeah.
An aircraft carrier is a bigger, more complex thing, and that means there have got to be a lot more rules and regulations about where the rope is stowed and how the anchor is lifted. Totally, it's a
Well,
given.
but it's almost more like rather than it's a lot easier to orchestrate to chart a course for one boat than it is to chart a course to simultaneously chart the correct course for 1,000 boats, right?
Yeah,
All
I don't
right.
know. Look, I mean, if you're talking, I think there's an inherent tension in the articles of our Constitution between federalism and dēmos, the people,
Right,
the
right, right.
idea of individual rule. And I think really it's the level of the many of us versus the direction of all of us more than the one state versus another state. I don't think it's a flotilla of 50 boats. I think it's really the tension between federalism and democracy that we see playing itself out. And as every competitive system will do, people with divergent interests will game the system. That is, they'll optimize their leverage in the system to their highest ability. And I think what we're seeing right now is that, yes, just as you say, the country is much bigger and it's organized in a way that our founders never anticipated. They didn't anticipate a party system. They certainly didn't anticipate a future in which you'd have a state the size of Wyoming and a state the size of California, both getting equal representation, whatever that means.
Yeah.
And I think you could argue about that kind of equality both in a bunch of ways, one of which doesn't get argued about at all, which is we're also not equal in resource. California's just got a lot more resource available to it than Wyoming does. Right? So there are all kinds of ways in which any set of concepts that a group of people agree to arrange themselves are tried by growth and change in unanticipated ways. And I think we're living through a lot of that. But I did not mean to say, and I don't agree that things are going to hell in a handbasket one egg at a time. I just think that our time relative to 100 years ago is complicated in different ways. I think the country has become more complicated. I think our sense of unity and our sense of inclusiveness in this government has become more complicated, and I think we're feeling a lot of the strain of that complication. That all said, I still think this democratic experiment is the best thing mankind's got going for it, and I think that this country stumbles through by and large and gets more things right than it gets wrong, and I think that's been the case for a very long time.
Yeah. And I agree with you on that. And you and I are, I don't know if we're in the minority when it comes to that, or if we're just or the minority is louder. But it seems like there's a lot of people who even so. Let me back up. And by the way, other little sidebars. I think maybe sometimes the resolving this conflict between the republic, the federal system, and the what was the Latin word you said? The dēmos, the people.
Greek, dēmos.
Greek, Greek. It's all Greek to me. But that's where like the democracy at the state level can become sort of the thing, kind of like Europe, right? Like you have like each country has its own thing going on, and then it all kind of gets stitched together in Europe. I think that the answer might be there, but that's for other people to figure out. But
wait, let me just interject one thing there. Originally, before we had parties, the thought was that's the House and the Senate. So the House was the Democratic, everybody's in there, right?
Bingo.
And the Senate was supposed to be the saucer that cooled the hot tea of the House and led to more rational, less impulsive decisions. Well, now when you throw two other things, you happen to be wearing red, I happen to be wearing blue. That's hilarious. But when you throw in things like political parties too on top of that, then the cross currents get to be really confusing and complicated, and they mess things up a lot.
Yeah, and 100 years later, you have the whatever the fundamental tenets of the parties or the different persuasions. They morph so much over time, because anytime you get humans involved, humans tend to be self-serving at some stage of our life, and we want that third martini or the cookie before we go to bed, and the next thing you know, but something that you said, which I've heard other people say, which is, and Adams even says in the book, he said he never pretends that we've done it perfectly. It's imperfect, but it's still better than what was it? Churchill, I think, said, right? He goes, he said, democracy is the worst system out there except for all the others, and or something like that. I might be paraphrasing. That's not Queen's English, but But there's a lot of people now, it seems like, and maybe there's not a lot. Maybe they're just a lot, but it seems like there's a lot that would say, no, 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 no. No, the system was wrong from the beginning. It was concocted by a bunch of middle-aged white guys who set it up for their own purpose. And maybe some people don't have that extreme view, but people who are kind of questioning, like, no, 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 this wasn't really wired up from the beginning to give everybody the opportunity to have better, richer, fuller. And so they want to say, like, we need to unwire it and start over again.
Oh, well, I think there's a middle course there too that recognizes that, just as you said, people always act in their own self-interests, and our founders were surely acting in their own self-interests. And if we could have a do-over with 200 plus years behind us of learning where the weak spots are, would we do things differently? Would they do things differently? Of course
Sure.
they would,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Fair
And
enough.
if they lived in a post-slavery world, an industrial world, in a modern world in which human rights were understood differently, would these smart, wise people have made different decisions? I can't help but think they would have. However, at the same time, as I like that you called out the Churchill quote, because it's the best system we've got right now. I don't like originalism. I don't like structuralism
Mm.
in any context because it presumes that an idea should be fixed in time, and that the people who came up with that idea are somehow more perfect than the
Yeah.
people who have to
Yeah.
use it. I think we need to keep stretching our understanding of how to make this thing work better, but I don't think we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think it's a remarkably strong, resilient, good system. That said, I also think that we're in difficult times for our democracy. I think, you and I both served. I mentioned that before. And one of the wonderful things for me about service was being in the Navy with a bunch of people that I would not have picked as friends, becoming their friends and realizing how superficial the differences between us were, and how important something I'd never considered important before was, which was that we're Americans. It's not really until you go abroad in the military as part of our military with other service people that you start to see, wow, there are things that draw us together and make us more alike in ways in which I actually would I'd actually take some pain to protect this doofus
Hmm.
if I
Yeah.
could,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
even though he's not somebody I would have wanted to know in my life before. And I fear that we've lost that sense of Americanness that says, this bigger idea is one I care a whole lot more about than, you know, who happens to be president, or who
Yeah.
won or who lost in the latest go round.
So you're tying in to something that a slightly different, but different angle, but the same thing. So I had Tony Manzer on a previous episode, and he's in the U.S. now. He's been here for many years. I believe I can't remember if he's a citizen now or he's got a green card, but his family's from Mexico. Originally, he was born there. He grew up there. He came here, and he was commenting on how what's so weird to him. He said what would be so strange in Mexico is, in Mexico, the country, what the country is and who the country is, has nothing to do with who the president is or
Mm.
who is in government or who, like, the country is the country. And he did an excellent job of explaining it, and I can't really do it justice, but of saying that it's not about like the leaders come and go, and the systems come and go, and the parties and all these other things come and go. But the people of the country are the people, and the country is the country, and that's kind of what you're getting at, right?
Yeah,
Which we're kind of losing that.
we are losing it.
I see what
Well,
you mean.
we're also losing. So you're talking about sort of a Falcon, the people and the land kind of thing. I think there's another level of Americanness
Yeah.
that's maybe a little bit more patriotic in its overtones. And I
Yeah.
don't mean that in a flag wavy way. I mean in the sense of all of us being part of and joined by something that in itself is extraordinarily important, and that transcends the things we disagree about.
Right.
I think we should be able to disagree vigorously and loudly, and at the same time to say, but I would take you over anybody else because you're my countryman, you're
Yeah.
an
Yeah.
American, right? And I fear that's what we're losing.
Yeah. Yeah. You know what else we're losing is enough time to keep talking about this, because I know that you you have to do something else in 3 minutes. However, we could do a part two if you're open to that, because
I would
I
love.
want to hear about. We can come back and do a part two, because when we were chatting earlier, you also mentioned this with your company. You rebranded a town in California, right?
City of Antioch.
Yeah,
That's right.
and who knew there was another Antioch? And and so there is at least one place, you said, in California where you can actually still, you know, not be you still have kind of a fair shake at life without having to spend $5 million on your house. You didn't say it
I would
that way,
love
but
to. I would love to
yeah,
talk about that with you. Yes, it's a city of Antioch. Their tagline is "Opportunity lives here," and I think it's true. And I would love to come
yeah.
back and talk about Antioch. So thank you so much for having me, Michael. It's been a lot of fun.